Hi everybody, this is Logan Isaac of Centurions Guild. We talk elsewhere about what the term Christian soldier means and how they have been around for a few millennia. So in this video we'll talk about moral injury and combat stress. These concepts are important to the church because clinical, pharmacological, therapeutic, and other interventions are valuable and necessary, but they must be accompanied by a rigorous engagement with a person's faith. Too often, care for soldiers is religion averse, and few veteran service organizations or government agencies are willing to get as theological with soldiers and veterans as the Guild is. This is often due to anxiety over the Constitution's Establishment Clause or concerns over tax-exempt status. But moral injuries cannot be ignored and also can't be treated the same way bodily injuries are. Unlike pharmacology, generic solutions won't work because they don't go deeply enough. Avoiding religion and theology is a dangerous oversight when we have in mind the epidemic rate of suicide within military communities. Let me explain why this is. Every few years, the Pew Research Center conducts a survey of thousands of Americans from all 50 states about their religious affiliations, called the Religious Landscape Survey, or RLS. Despite widely reported data about the decline of formal church membership and dwindling numbers of Christians attending weekly worship, over 70% of Americans still identify as Christian. That means that a solid majority of Americans still identify with a specific faith with particular resources, practices, and beliefs. Applying the 70% determined by the RLS to the military community helps us understand the concentration of veterans who are also Christians. Assuming most active soldiers receive care directly from the military, we'll only look at veterans just to save a bit of time. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, the total population of veterans in the U.S. is 2.6 million. You'll see that by applying the 70% data point from the RLS would mean that nearly 15.2 million American veterans also identify as Christian. Trying to determine the number of veterans who identify as Christian who also suffer from some form of combat stress would need to incorporate conflict-specific trauma rates. Last year, I set out to do just that, but I calculated the stress rates prior to applying the Pew data. You can find this on my website, imloganmi.org, but hopefully these screenshots will give you some idea of how complicated it can be. So there are no living World War I veterans anymore, but I found that World War II has 1.7 million living veterans with a 27% trauma rate. So about 459,000 World War I veterans live with combat stress of some kind. Furthermore, the Korean War has 2.3 million living veterans at also a 27% trauma rate. So something like 621,000 Korea veterans live with combat stress as well. Moving forward, the Vietnam War has 7.4 million living veterans at a 30% trauma rate. So something like 2.2 million Vietnam vets live with combat stress. The Gulf War, the first Iraq War, depending on how you phrase it, has 2.3 million living veterans at a 12% trauma rate. So something like 276,000 Gulf War vets live with combat stress. And finally, my generation of veterans of OEF and OEF have 1.95 million living veterans at a 15.5% PTS rate. So something like 302,000 of my peers live with combat stress. It's important to point out that these numbers are a very, very conservative estimate. They only count formal diagnoses, either in private sector through private healthcare and providers, or through the VA. Less than half of all those 21.6 million veterans are using the VA, and of the 60% who do not use the VA, most of those do not use private care but go without it. And so the numbers that I've cited prior are all a no lesser than. I mean, that is the most conservative estimate you can get. And if all that is true, then we can total the raw numbers for an educated guess as to how many veterans of any conflict are currently living with combat stress. So if my math is right, then we can reliably guess that almost 3.9 million veterans are currently living with some form of combat stress. So let that sink in for just a second. If there are 322 million Americans, this is just under 10% of our population who are both veterans and also living with combat stress. Now let's think about how this relates to the church. If Christians are as well represented in the military community as they are in the general American population, then the number of Christian veterans living with combat stress would be about 70% of the total number of veterans living with combat stress. And if that's true, that means that 2.7 million Christian veterans are living with some form of combat stress. 2.7 million men and women identify as Christian and suffer from combat stress, but have startlingly few distinctively Christian resources for understanding the complex intersection of armed service and their own particular faith. Moral injury, this new term that a lot of folks are talking about, is a very important concept, but it's an incomplete model for care. You see, injuries are somatic. They require a body. Treating injuries assumes a number of skills that takes years to master. Paramedics, for example, have to be experts in anatomy, physiology, and all kinds of other bodily sciences. But with moral injury, we don't often hear talk about the moral person or body upon which a moral injury is inflicted. If you're into antiquarian books like I am, you'll find that psychological is just the latest way to say psychical, from psyche, which explains why we call moral injuries soul wounds and why mental health experts are usually consulted. However, an overemphasis on the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, in its 5th edition, I believe, can have the unintended effect of mistaking people for their diagnoses. I have a diagnosis, but it's not what I am. When people make the subtle mistake of assuming that combat stress is my primary feature, I become a walking privation. I am what I lack. For example, if you want to lead a small group or offer spiritual direction for veterans, and you cite a learning objective as, say, increasing resiliency, then you're actually reinforcing the dangerous stereotype that veterans are not already resilient. Now, maybe it's my ego, but I suspect that boot camp, airborne training, air assault school, and 14 months in combat have pretty well established that I can take a beating and a half. In fact, in the 10 years since I've been a vet myself, I don't think I've ever met a veteran deficient in resilience, self-esteem, or the myriad other qualities we are often told that we lack. This is the danger of focusing too much on diagnoses, and it's why the church needs a constructive account of what it means to be a Christian soldier, not based on stereotypes or caricatures, but on the witness of our diverse history and traditions. The church cannot safely speak of injuries until we accurately identify features of the moral body upon which the infliction of moral injuries is possible in the first place. So, what do you think? Let us know your thoughts, or if you have any feedback. You can do so in the comment section below, but you can also email us at info@centurionsguild.org or reach us through our contact page at centurionsguild.org/contact. We look forward to hearing from you and keeping this conversation going.